Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the love-hate production company with both bops and flops, A24. If you've been around on my channel for quite some time, you might know my love-hate relationship with A24. I think they make some phenomenal movies, and I think they are a little bit too artsy-fartsy for my personal taste a lot of the time. So today we're going to be talking about the top 10 A24 horror movies. In my opinion, this is my personal top 10 list for A24 horror movies. I think there's only 18 A24 horror movies to choose from at this current point in time, at the time that I'm filming this video, so make sure you check the date of when this video goes up if you're watching this from the future, and there's more A24 horror movies. As of right now, there's only 18, so I am including a majority of A24 horror movies, but I am excluding at least 8, so stay tuned to see which ones those are. Keep in mind, everyone is going to have different opinions. For some reason, people seem to feel very strongly about A24 movies, either one way or another, so just bear in mind that I'm going to have some on my list that you absolutely hate, and you know that I'm not going to be including A24's cult classic, The Lighthouse, if you've been around for a while. It's not on this list. With that being said, please tell me your favorite horror A24 movies down below, and if you're curious of my favorite non-horror A24 movies, they would be The Florida Project, Swiss Army Man, Room, and The Bling Ring, just in case you were curious. I still have taste, okay? So before we get into the top 10 list, I just want to thank Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of different types of classes for creatives to inspire your creativity, learn new skills, or strengthen existing passions. Skillshare offers classes on so many different types of varying subjects, from photography to video creation to freelancing to writing. Anything you can think to learn about is on Skillshare. One class that I've personally been super excited about is the Writer's Toolkit, 6 Steps to a Successful Writing Habit by Simon Van Buie. I've mentioned this briefly in the past, but I actually stepped away from my other channel, not only to focus on this channel, but also to finally write my books. And personally, I find Skillshare has so many inspiring and helpful classes when it comes to writing. Simon's class talks about 6 approachable steps to making writing a daily habit by creating your own space, finding your medium, and sticking to a routine. Skillshare is curated specifically for learning, so that means there are absolutely no ads, and they're constantly launching brand new premium classes. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in my description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity today. All right, let's get into my top 10 A24 horror movies. Granted, these are all horror adjacent, so not all of them are going to be directly described as horror. But let's start with a very controversial one, shall we? And that is Tusk. This movie came out in 2014 and follows a podcast host played by Justin Long on the search for interesting people to interview when he discovers a man with an extraordinary past. The podcaster soon learns the man has a dark secret involving a walrus. People typically fall into 3 different categories when it comes to Tusk. They either think it's, enjoyable, disturbing, a pretty decent movie. They think it's way too disturbing to ever rewatch again, or they just never want to watch it because they hear it's so disturbing. Or 3, they think it's one big joke and it's hilarious. Personally, I fall into the former category. This movie is written and directed by Kevin Smith and is described as a dark comedy, so possibly that's why some people see this as one big joke, or that it's intended to be humorous more than it is, because a dark comedy still can have very disturbing elements, and I think Tusk is very successful in showing that. But maybe because of the comedy aspects, and Justin Long is pretty funny, Johnny Depp is also in this, I think maybe that's why some people can't take this movie as seriously as maybe it should, because it is highly disturbing if you're the right person for it. Like I said, some people just, it's a joke to them. So, and describing it to someone makes it sound like a joke. Like, you can't take this movie seriously until you're actually going through the movie and experiencing it for yourself. You're either going to find this movie really, really disturbing or hilarious. And either way, I think it makes for an entertaining movie, so I highly recommend it. Also, watch it with people. It's a fun time. Next up, you saw this one coming because of my shirt, we're going to be talking about Midsummer. This folk horror movie follows a couple who travel to Sweden with a few friends to witness the Midsummer festival, but soon discover they're in the clutches of a pagan cult. I don't think I need to go too into depth as to why I love Midsummer and why it's one of my favorite A24 movies, because it's highly popular among horror fans, obviously. And it's directed by Ari Aster, who also brought us the famous Hereditary. So I think people know by now what's going on with Midsummer. To me, this movie is a great example of horror that is highly effective for me personally, just for personal reasons. The drug thing, which typically is a no-go for me in movies, but I think this movie executes it so well that it's just so effective for me horror-wise. Also, I love that it completely takes place during the daytime, so every year I like to rewatch this movie. Well, it's only been out for a couple years, but every year I like to rewatch this movie as a summer, daytime type horror movie, and this year I actually have the director's cut, which I have yet to watch, which has a bunch of extra clips and things that were edited out to get a better like R rating or something like that. So if you have seen the director's cut of Midsummer, please let me know how you like it, and I will report back in one of my monthly recaps. Next up, we have The Monster from 2016. This follows a neglectful mother and daughter who are making a trip through a storm when they break down on a deserted road. They soon discover they are not alone in the woods and must confront a terrifying monster. I consider this movie to be a little bit more on the mild horror side. It's definitely more psychological, atmospheric, thriller-esque, I would say, than on the horror side. It's not the best on this list by any means. It's not one of my favorite A24 movies ever, but I do recommend checking it out because I think it's a little bit underrated. And the acting is actually really incredible, and the atmosphere and the setting where this takes place is just really nice to watch on like a rainy evening. And the buildup of tension and fear in this movie is also really effective, with lots of little symbolism things throughout this movie. And it honestly kind of reminds me in tone and concept of The Babadook in a way because of the symbolism throughout. So if you're a fan of The Babadook, I think you'd be a fan of The Monster. Next up, we have The Blackcoats Daughter from 2015. I've talked about this one somewhat recently, so I won't spend too long on this one. This follows a young woman on her way to a prep school where two students have been stranded and forced to face a sinister evil force. I wrote that very strangely. Forced to face an evil force. This movie is not what it sounds like. It's definitely one of those that's way more complex than you think it is, and by reading descriptions or even watching trailers, you're not going to be expecting half of this movie. It may take multiple viewings, and it's definitely one of those movies where you have to be in the right setting and mindset and not be on your phone, not be distracted, because you're going to want to pay attention to all of the little details. This is not one you pop on in the background. You have to immerse yourself in the Blackcoats Daughter experience. It's directed by Oz Perkins, who also brought us I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House and Gretel and Hansel, which are two movies I've talked about before, and hands down two of the most beautiful, visually stunning movies I have ever seen. And I think Blackcoats Daughter goes into that as well, because he's just so talented at building settings and atmosphere, and it's just, all his movies are gorgeous. So if you're really into atmosphere and beauty and just amazing storytelling, then definitely check out Blackcoats Daughter. Next up, we have Saint Maud, that came out this year. This directorial debut from Rose Glass follows a young, impressionable nurse who pursues Christian devotion after trauma. Now she cares for a hospice patient and ex-dancer. Maud's faith inspires an obsession to save this woman's soul. So I had a little bit of hesitation going into Saint Maud. However, I think that helped me love this movie even more. Again, this is another movie that's very atmospheric, very focused on the character acting and the setting and everything like that to build the story, which is not going to be for everyone. But the religious horror and symbolism in this movie are incredible. And this is one that I'd say there are minor horror elements in here, but when we do get horror, it can be kind of intense. So it's really hard to say if this is like described truly as a horror, because it absolutely is a horror movie, but the amount of horror, I guess, that we get in it isn't much, but when we do get it, it's a lot, if that makes sense. What is in there is very powerful given the context and the acting. And the last image of this movie still haunts me to this day and just made the movie experience for me, and it's definitely one of the best A24 movies I've ever seen. Next up, we have Enemy from 2013. This surreal neo-noir psychological thriller stars Jake Gyllenhaal, who portrays a college professor who discovers a man that looks exactly like him and decides to delve into his private affairs. This is probably the least horror movie on this list, definitely psychological thriller type movie, but I had to include it because of the psychological aspect, and the tension in this movie is just so effective. Despite it having generally lower ratings than a lot of movies on this list, I would say that Enemy is one of the most entertaining and well done movies on this list. This is based on a novel called The Double by Jose Saramago, and that's not to be confused with the movie The Double starring Jesse Eisenberg, not the same thing. And this movie is just really interesting to me because the cast had to sign confidentiality agreements about the symbolism in this movie, where they aren't allowed to talk about the symbolism in interviews or anything like that, or divulge information of what certain things are meant to symbolize. So it's always left up for the viewer's interpretation, which I really love. And there are some things online that you can read about regarding the symbolism in this movie, but I like that we're still able to make those conclusions ourselves because the cast was not allowed to divulge that. Next up is Green Room from 2015. I've recommended this one a lot on this channel already, but let's say we do it again. This follows a punk rock band that becomes trapped in a venue after witnessing a murder. The band become targets for the skinhead owners of the venue who want to eliminate all evidence and witnesses of the crime. If you want gore and body horror, this is the one. The casting in this movie I think is incredible. It has Imogen Poots, Anton Yelchin, and Patrick Stewart, among many other people, and is directed by Jeremy Saulnier, who is one of my favorite horror directors of all time. He's also given us Blue Ruin, Murder Party, and Hold the Dark, so I think his movies are just phenomenal, and he has Macon Blair star, I think, in all of his work, because they work closely together, and he's also in Green Room. So just go watch it if you haven't by now, because I'll probably keep bringing it up and talking about it in future videos. Next, we have It Comes at Night, 2017. This one is going to be one of those love or hate movies on this list, and probably a more controversial choice as well, much like Tusk. This psychological horror movie follows two families who are forced to share a home after a mysterious apocalypse. Now, I think the idea of this movie is really original and worth watching. Again, it's not my favorite one on this list. It's not the best one, and it's going to leave a lot of people frustrated because I think it's marketed as a true horror when in reality it's more of a thriller. Again, it's about the atmosphere, the acting. Some of you will be dissatisfied with the ending of this movie, but I think it's actually really well done. Almost feels like a M. Night Shyamalan movie, but if his ideas were executed a little bit better. This is another movie where the cast also had to sign non-disclosure agreements regarding the details about this movie. And there are a lot of artistic choices throughout this movie that I think are really effective, especially if you read about them after you see it and then go and rewatch the movie. It feels very much like an A24 movie in that way, in a good way. All right, next up we have The Witch from 2015. How many movies have we had from 2015 on this list? I feel like we've had at least 3. Yeah, we've had 3 from 2015. That was just the year of A24. People think 2018, 2019 was. I think it was 2015. Anyway, The Witch, this period piece taking place in the 1630s, follows a family whose youngest disappears and the other siblings begin to blame the eldest sister of witchcraft. So in my horror movie rewatchability video, I will link that video up here where I talk about how some horror movies actually don't have rewatchability to me, and I mentioned The Witch in that, but I had actually seen The Witch more than once. I had just forgotten that I had done that. So yes, it doesn't have a lot of rewatchability for me because it's one of those movies that's just almost too good. It's one of those where the setting has to be right, the mood has to be right, because it's a lot to take in, kind of like Hereditary and whatnot. And this movie is also done by Robert Eggers, who also brought us The Lighthouse, which obviously that's one of my controversial opinions. I wasn't a huge fan of The Lighthouse because of the artistic choices. Granted, I see the appeal. I just want to say that. I see why people like it so much and why they think of it as a great movie. I get it. It's just not for me. I'm not the target audience. However, The Witch, that's a different story. I think some of his choices work and some don't. And in The Witch, I think it has a lot to offer, just given the atmosphere, the story, the performances, the setting, everything like that just really worked for me. All right, last movie we're going to talk about, and then we have an honorable mention because how can I talk about A24 horror movies without mentioning it? But we'll get to that. False Positive, that also recently came out, I think a couple weeks ago. This follows a couple who are struggling to get pregnant when they discover Dr. Hindle, who works his magic, and they soon become pregnant. However, Lucy begins to have her doubts regarding the pregnancy and Dr. Hindle's methods. I think this is a controversial choice to put in the 10th spot because although we only have around 18-ish horror movies from A24, putting this one in it when it's so new, I think might be questionable, and a lot of you are probably scoffing at that right now. Like most A24 horror movies, or A24 movies period, False Positive got a lot of mixed reviews. I think a lot of A24 is hit or miss for most people, and False Positive is definitely one of those. It gets weird. It's a very strange movie, but I enjoyed it. This is probably the weirdest movie on this list. Yes, I think it even gets a little bit weirder than Tusk, which is, they're kind of in the same ballpark when it comes to weird A24 horror movies, in my opinion. So if you want something weird like that, then watch False Positive. I think the cast of False Positive is a really unique one, with Alana Glazer playing a more serious role. I thought it was really nice to see her in that. And I'm just surprised that not more people are talking about False Positive. I think because it kind of went under the radar. It was just streaming on Hulu, which is kind of random. I think maybe some people thought it was one of those Blumhouse movies, and they didn't necessarily know that it was an A24 movie. I will say the ending kind of leaves something to be desired, and it gets even weirder towards the end, and not necessarily in a good way. It's just weird, and almost just weird for weird's sake, you know? But overall, I was entertained by this, and the general concept is horrifying in and of itself. So that alone makes this a pretty decent horror movie, in my opinion. So I just want to address that you're probably wondering why Hereditary is not in my top 10 when it is obviously one of, if not the most loved A24 horror movies of all time. Not just horror movies, but A24 movies, period. And I will include it here as an honorable mention, which I know is going to piss a lot of people off for including it as just an honorable mention. My whole reasoning for not including it at all in this list and just kind of throwing it in at the end is because I've only seen it the one time in theaters. Was it phenomenal? Absolutely. It's not a rewatchable movie to me, and at the end of the day, I watch horror movies mostly for entertainment. Like, yes, there are times where I want to be moved, I want to feel emotion, I want to go through an experience, and I want it to scare me and horrify me, and Hereditary does that, but not all the time. And most of the time I don't want that. So it's almost too effective for me personally, emotionally, that I just feel like all the other movies that I talked about in this video had more entertainment value for me personally than Hereditary does. Is it incredible? Absolutely. It's one of the most effective horror movies I've ever seen, and one that genuinely got to me in the theater so much that I have not rewatched it. I can't do it. I'm just not emotionally stable enough to go through that right now, so I can't do it. So the more entertainment value movies have, the more I'm going to gravitate towards rewatching those, and thus we have my top 10 list from A24, and does not include Hereditary. But I obviously wanted to address that, because if I didn't, people would be like, where the hell is Hereditary? Anyway, that's my top 10 A24 horror movie list. I would love to hear your favorite horror and non-horror, for that matter, A24 movies down below. Are you more on the love side of A24 or the hate side of A24? They're really, it could go either way, you know? They really have hits and misses. But anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts down below. I hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.